right, so let's take a look at some of the these CSS examples, in particular how we can accomplish and implement a grid system. All right, what is it? Why do we need it? So grid system is based on the more basic idea of using floats. Right, a float is a mechanism that allows us to have content to override the basic mechanism of rendering things in blocks or inline, and making so that we can have things that typically would render as blocks render as if they were inline, or vice versa. One of the things that allows us to do is to make things rendered side by side. Okay? Typically, a div by default, right, wants to render from left to right, taking up the entire width of the page. So div is a very common element that allows you to divide the page into rectangular sections, right? And by default, let's grab these. Let's grab that, and let's create a little playpen here. Let's do public. Let's go on to. Oh wait, no, this is not it. Let me close that. Let me open webdev, and let's go into lectures, lectures, graduate, and let's open up here, create a directory where we can play around with HTML, and here we'll say floats. So typically, if you just have divs, right, their behavior. Right, if I run this and I navigate there, let's see, let's navigate there, localhost, let's go to lectures, graduate, HTML, float. Right, so the behavior is to just render and take up the entire width of the page. Right, so that's div 1, div 2, and div 3. Let's give them some h1 so that we know which one is which. So this is div 1. This is div 2, and this is div 3. So this is the most common block elements, right, in the HTML arsenal. Right, they take up the entire width of the page, as much width as the parent container gives it, right, and then everything inside just resizes accordingly. Notice that the width is by default it takes up the entire width of the page. But the height, right, changes with the content that's inside, right? So if we look at the content, we put this on the right-hand side, and we hover over that. Notice that if we make this half of what it was, notice that the height increased. See that? Right, so the height changes to contain whatever's inside. Right, so everything else pushes the boundaries and expands it. And we can certainly change the size of these things. Let's change the and the color. So let's do that. We can do that in a style element. Right? We can use a style element to refer to different colors of these things. So we can say refer to this div that has the yellow. We can say dot yellow. We can change the background color to be yellow. Right, so if we refresh, notice that div 1 is now yellow. Let's do the same thing with div 2. So we'll say div 2 is, let's see, it uses the color blue, so we'll say blue. So the background color is blue. So there it is. So we have div 1, div 2, and we'll have the third one is div 3. We'll color it red. So it says red, background color, and then red. Background color red. Yes? So by default, it just takes up the entire width of the page. Now, when you change the width of these things, right? So say you change the width of the yellow box, and you change the width to be 200 pixels. Right? Notice that the width changes, right? And because it doesn't fit, the content just expands down below, right? Even if you make it very, very thin, let's say we go down to 50. Right? Notice that the bottom half this one over here, even though there's space for the blue to show in there, it doesn't like go and take up that space, right? It's still behaving in the block mechanism, right? It just adds the vertical space. You might say, well, it's because it doesn't fit, right? Because it's too wide. But even if you make its width of the blue one also 50, which makes it thin enough to be able to fit, it does not. It doesn't want to behave inline, right? It's still behaving in block, right? And we can override that. Let's not make it so for now. Let's make it 100 and 100. And let's make them all 100. Okay, so they're all 100. So they would all fit, right? If we want them all 100, notice that they all have a column class. We could apply that transformation of 100 pixels to this common class that is being applied to all of them. So we could factor that. We could factor that transformation out for all of them in there instead of applying it to each one individually. Right, so that works. Right now it's being applied to all of them. And so what other things we could do is that we could override their behavior and say, hey, don't behave inline anymore. Right? Instead, right, float left. Right? And what this does is that it says, don't behave block anymore. Float everything. So whatever the whatever the leftmost element, wherever it ended up, start rendering right there. Okay, without adding a vertical spacing, right? And what that gives us is the capability of showing things side by side, right? Showing them in columns, which we couldn't earlier, right? And it was the whole idea behind using tables in the first place. Yes?
So if you squeeze the whole window to make it less than 300?
Yeah, they start behaving inline, right? So it starts wrapping. It doesn't fit anymore, right? So notice that down below, right, if I go and it doesn't fit, it wraps and goes underneath. So it's behaving inline, what we kind of were looking for, right? That to be able to switch between these two behaviors, right? But now it's an entire block as opposed to a single word, right? Or a single sentence, right? So what Bootstrap and all these CSS grid libraries out there, what they do is that they take this idea and they just run with it, and they say, okay, well, let's take this idea even further. They come up with different sizes, right? Different sizes for different screens, right? For different size screens, and they breaking up the entire width of the page into these 12 portions, right? Okay. So let's take this idea a little further, and let's look at the second example that we show you here. The second idea, the float, the grid. Here's an example, right? What we've done here is that we've broken up the page not quite into 12 portions. I don't remember. Let me view the source. So here's a source, right? What we've done here is that we have an outer div. We have an outer div, and we call that container, right? And that container, notice what it's doing, right? It's applying a different technique that we skipped over. We skipped over this technique. That is basically saying, I want to be 600 pixels wide, right? And the margin, I'm going to leave it up to you. I'm going to leave it up to the browser, right? And margin is this is handling all the margins around me, right? This is handling my left margin, my right margin. So how much space do I have between me and my rightmost neighbor, and how much space do I have to my rightmost neighbor, my topmost, and the bottommost, right? And what this does, right? This container does. It's a very common technique to achieve the following, right? Notice that it's centered. See that it's centered, right? And the way it's doing that is that it's setting a width of the overall container to be 600 pixels. So from between here and here it's 600 pixels wide, right? And the margins, notice that we haven't determined what the margins are. We didn't say I want margins 30 pixels or 60 pixels. We're saying auto. Basically, we're saying whatever is left over, right? It's another way of saying whatever's left over. I want to be 600 pixels, and whatever is left over, that's what my margins want to be, right? And since I'm not saying which one is which, they both are the same, right? Equivalent. And that's why it behaves as if it were centered at all times. See that? It's a very common mechanism for centering content, and it's used widely in many, many different websites that you see that they're centered, right? They set up a particular width, and they go with that. Make sense? All right. So from within this container, we've declared several rows. So divs that are rows, right? So basically what we're looking for is basically the same features we had with tables. You know that tables were so convenient because they broke the content, right, in these nice vertical rows, right? These horizontal rows, and then each row would then be broken into these horizontal columns, right? It was very, very convenient. So we want to go back and use those same features, but without using tables, right? Because tables were not meant for this, right? We can achieve the same thing with CSS. So notice that we have here one div that starts here and ends here. There's another div that starts here and ends here. They all have class equal row. See that? Class equal row, which are meant to behave like the table rows. Yes? Right? And then inside of each one of these rows, div rows, we have several divs, each one with a class column something. Column something everywhere. See that? Column something, column something, column something. Yes? Everybody okay? All right. This one repeats down below. We have, again, a row, and then several columns. Then another row with another 2 columns. Make sense? And notice that the way they render is pretty much like we would expect. Notice that in this one, we have the last one here, the last row has 2 columns. 2 columns, and there they are, right? There's the last row with 2 columns that starts here. Here's one of the columns, and here's the second column. See that? Right? Notice the naming convention that I'm using. Column dash 60. Column dash 6 and column dash 6. Right? Right? With the notion, right, that the page is presumably, broken up into 6 equal portions. Yes? Right? Of which I want my left-hand side to take up 6 of those 12 portions, and the other one take up 6 of those 12 portions. So they're the same, right, on either side. I could have chosen 4 and 8, right? That would have worked too. They would have added to 12. If they don't add to 12, well, it's whatever they add up to, and everything else is just left over, empty. Okay? That would work as well. Right? And these also, same thing. Here's a row of which there are 4 columns, each one of 3 portions each, right? Which is 3 times 4 is 12. Right? And same thing here, we have 6 columns, of which each is 2 portions each. So it comes out to 12 in total, right? And what we've done is that we have done the math a priori, right? We've done all this math beforehand and say, well, how wide does column 2 need to be to take up 6% or whatever percent it is, right, of 12? Well, it needs to be 100 pixels out of 600, which is my entire 12 columns, right? A 2 portion needs to be 100, right? And a 1 column needs to be 50. Yes? Like dividing 600 divided by 12, or dividing it by 6, or dividing it by 4, or divided by 3, you come up with these values. Right? For a column of size 6, needs to be half of 600. Yes? Something of column 3, right, needs to be 150, so divided by 4. Right? Column 2 needs to be divided by 6, right? So you get 100 pixels. Yes? Everybody following? Right? So when you put them all together, they all add up to 600 again. Make sense? And each one is all float left, float left. They're all float left. See that? Float left, float left, float left. Right? So they're all going to stack next to each other, side by side. Right? And that's how you accomplish this mechanism of stacking columns next to one another. It looks almost like a table. It behaves almost like a table. So we're able to reproduce the behavior of tables without tables. Everybody okay? Right? So we've done this with a toy example, right? What Bootstrap does is that it really goes on and make this very, very industry strength grid system, right? That is very, very powerful, which I would like to show you next. So Bootstrap, I think I have examples here actually. So if you go to Bootstrap, you have the grid system. Right? So this grid system, this is the, I don't know, let me see, is it showing anything? No. All right, so this is just using, oh, maybe because I'm too, okay, there we go. I was too close. I had zoomed in. It didn't fit in the page, right? So this is Bootstrap grid system, right? It's inside of a container, so it has margins on either side. And also, notice that this one is a 12. The first one here is 12 columns wide. This is 6 columns and 6 columns, right? This is 4 columns, so it comes out to be 3 times 4 is 12. This is 3 columns wide, each one, which you multiply by 4, it comes out to be 12, right? And what they do, notice that not only looks nice, right? They add these gutters in between, right? Some spacing, so that even if there's too much content, right? There's always some margins in between, so it looks nice at all times. Also, some spacing in between the rows and spacing between the columns as well. So it looks much nicer than what we were doing, right? Ours were all just stuck together and smooshed, right? Also, they provide this layout for different sizes of pages, right? So this one is a 12. It's a container that again breaks up the page into 12 sections, but for the largest of screens, right? For the largest of screens. If the screen is smaller than the largest of screens, notice what happens, right? It defaults back to block, right? It defaults back to block. So this is configured to behave as a column in columns only in large screens, or big screens, grid large, right? Anything lower than a particular threshold, it defaults back to the original behavior of divs, of dividers, right? They default back to the block behavior, right? Which is fine, right? And then as it gets smaller and smaller, it again responds, right? It makes it even smaller, up until you reach a threshold that it doesn't go any further. And notice that the content is viewable at all screen sizes, right? If it's large screen, it lays out for a large screen with lots of columns. But for smaller screens, it defaults back to, this would be fine, readable on a phone. Okay, everybody okay? Right? Let me show you another example, right? For not large screen, but medium-sized screens, right? So medium-sized screens behave exactly the same way for large screens, right? But as you get smaller and to get into medium-sized screens, right? Notice that it keeps the same layout, but for a smaller size screen. Okay, and this would be fine, right? You might say, well, I am targeting, 3200 size screens, right? And then my next smallest one might be 1800. And then my next smaller might be 1200. And my next smaller is 600, right? So you're targeting different layouts for different pages, right? And perhaps as you become smaller and smaller and smaller, you have less and less columns, right? If you have a really big newspaper, that's okay to have tons and tons of columns, right? But as it becomes a smaller screen on a phone, it makes no sense to have a column, right? To have a bunch of columns. So this is targeting those two size screens, large screens and medium-sized screens. And anything smaller than medium, it defaults back to block. Yes? Right. So let's look at another one. Small screens. So this one, again, it behaves the same from small screens and above. So I want columns from small screens and above. So again, for large screens you have them, for medium-sized screens you have them, and then for small screens you have them. So this is what you might see on an iPad, right? On a small mobile tablet. And when it becomes smaller and smaller, right, it defaults to just block, right? Everything starts wrapping like block. Yes? Right? I just spoke. Wait, I just spoke to Shannon. It's funny what she cheated. Never mind that. That's I'm blushing. That's actually a project I'm working with some students. Not why Angelina cheated. On a application for folks to talk to in different languages, which is pretty cool. If anybody's interested, I'd love to work. So here's extra small screens, right? Now here's saying, hey, I want the grid system, this layout, regardless of the size of the screen, right? Starting from really, really tiny screens on a small phone, right? Even up to large screens, right? So in this one, you know, it doesn't matter as small as it becomes, right? Even in tiny iPhones, right? You would see all those really, really tiny columns. Whether it makes sense to you or not, that's your design decision, right? But the responsive grid layout allows you to choose whether you want them or not, right? Whether you want to fall back to the block at different screen sizes. Make sense, right? And all this making use of the techniques that we just showed you earlier, where splitting something 600 and choosing the floating left and different sizes for the columns and whatnot. Yes. Right? Now, this behavior is fully documented at Bootstrap. If you go to CSS and take a look at their grid system, they fully document all their column settings, right? And all the screen sizes that they target. So for instance, they target from screen size of 1200 and above. That's what they consider large desktop. For desktops that are between 992 and 1200, they also they consider to be those medium-sized devices. Small-sized devices, they consider things that are 768 and above, right? Those thresholds, and anything below that they consider to be small devices, right? These are all overridable. You can override them if you want to target specific devices, right? You can change those thresholds. And then they give you examples on how to break them up, right? With columns, with medium 8 to 4, so they all add up to 12, 4, 4, 4, 6, 6, and they give you a snippet of HTML code to be able to lay it out any which way you want. Okay, make sense? All right. So we're going to be using this quite a lot to be able to support these mechanisms of making portrait and landscape and making things show up and disappear, right? And going between two columns to a single column, back and forth as the size changes when you flip things and you resize. Yes? Okay, so I encourage you to read some of this documentation, at least to know where things are. If you need to reference at any point, if you want if you care to, or if you run into problems, definitely make sure that you know where things are. All right, let's see, what else? All right, we looked at the grid system. Other things that you might want to take a look at is how Bootstrap formats different input fields for the form. Okay, how they how they format text area, dates and emails and sliders, right? All these are input fields that are supported by Bootstrap that certainly you are encouraged to use. Also notice horizontal forms that are responsive, right? That would show labels on the left-hand side and input fields on the right-hand side with large screens, but as screen size becomes smaller and smaller, they are responsive and they switch to a top-down layout as opposed to a left-right layout. See that, right? So again, those kinds of things are very, very important to support. Also, notice that the inline forms that are configured to render from left to right, maybe perhaps if they are part of a header or footer, right? They are responsive so that when there's not enough space, right, they switch back into block rendering, right? So that they render either online if you have a header or footer that is long, right? But as you decrease, right, it becomes block so that you can fill it out. What else? Obviously, you have a color picker, you have a date picker, and things like that. So definitely become familiar with Bootstrap or whatever grid system you're going to use for your project, right? If you're going to use Material, become familiar with their documentation on where to find things, right? Ideally, what you would do is that if you want to build, or use or implement an elements, right, or set of user interface, first look if they already have something for you. Okay, if they already have some components that are already reusable as is, instead of you trying to reinvent them from scratch, see if Materials already has a component or Bootstrap has a component. You can just copy and paste their snippet of code, right, and right into your code. Okay, so don't try to reinvent the wheel. Okay, make sure that to see if it's already there. Right? Oh, obviously, if it's open source and you can use it, right? Don't just go blatantly grabbing stuff, right? So for instance, they have all sorts of components for text editing and for different sizes of buttons, for alerts, for creating drop downs and action items, for creating drop downs that can show up or down or left or right. So again, don't try to reinvent any of this, right? Just feel free to copy their snippet of code. Make sure you understand how it works, right? So you can put it in and can debug if it's not behaving exactly as you want it. Be careful. Bootstrap uses a lot of these hashes. Okay, be careful. Those hashes mean something in Angular. All right. Bootstrap doesn't necessarily know about Angular, and Angular doesn't necessarily know about Bootstrap. Bootstrap might add all these hashes in there, unintentionally breaking your Angular application. So careful with those hashes. You'll need to remove them, or at least know what you're doing. Okay, careful with the hashes. So drop downs and action items. You can make dividers. You can disable input menu items. You can create button groups from left to right for pagination. You can have different sizes of buttons that are next to one another. You can combine buttons with drop downs, right, into one contiguous toolbar. You can have buttons together with drop downs. So make sure you look at these components before you go off and create your own CSS, right? It's better to start with something that already exists and then customize it to your liking. That's a very common thing to do, right? You start from a very well accepted library and then you customize it to your liking. You have buttons with different color schemes. These are the standard Bootstrap color schemes, right? Blue is the primary color, success is green, info is cyan, yellow is warning, red is danger. Sizing really large buttons or smaller buttons. Input groups, you can combine input fields with buttons or input fields with labels, or radio buttons and checkboxes with input fields. There's all sorts of things. Please take a look at what's in here. You can create tabs or pills, right, for navigation purposes. You can create headers at the top with drop-downs, navigation bars that have search bars or drop-downs at the top. You can stick them to the top or stick them to the bottom, right? With lots and lots of menus, images, forms in the input fields, buttons in the input fields, normal content. Or here's fixed. You can fix it to the top, right, so that it doesn't scroll with the rest of the content. Or footers fixed to the bottom, so you have a footer that doesn't scroll as you scroll. So take a look at this. So none of this, right? None of this in the component needs JavaScript. None of this needs JavaScript. Okay, but there are some components that do need JavaScript, right? So for instance, they have here some carousels for images, right? For that, you'll need JavaScript, right? So there's quite a components here that pop over, alerts, collapse, carousels, right? With slides, right? For that you'll need JavaScript, right? For that you'll need to load the JavaScript library for Bootstrap, right? But it's not required for this assignments, right? But if you want, you can start playing around with it. Right, one of the things here in the getting started is that they give you some templates to get started with, right? Some really, really simple templates to get started that are already responsive. So if you inspect here, if you inspect it to the right-hand side, it's already responsive. So if it doesn't fit, notice that it creates this drop-down on the top right, and is right, you can make it smaller and smaller, and it's accessible through the phone. Well, not very, very small phones, right? It wraps. Yours will not wrap, right? Careful with that. See, if it doesn't fit, it should not push content down, right? Also notice that the content at the top, the header at the top is fixed, right? It's fixed, so you can scroll, and the top does not scroll. Okay. So these are nice little templates that you can get started with. Here's some with a like a splash at the top, right? Some marketing blurb at the top, and maybe some products that you're selling or that you're promoting, or some articles that have been recently written, or some books that somebody has recently reviewed, right? You can show it here as content. Showing some activity on your website. You can put the login page right there, as opposed to have a dedicated page. So feel free to grab one of these as a starting point for your landing page. This could be already your home page, yes, and fill it in with your own content. Right? I would encourage you to make it more to your liking, right, and customize it. So let's grab maybe I don't know. Yeah, let's grab this one, and we can look at the content. Well, actually no. Let's grab example. We'll grab this one. Which is the simplest one? Let's grab this one. Okay. So we can look at the source code. We can look at the source code and notice that it's using Bootstrap Minim and the favicon and things that we're not going to use most of this, right? But we can grab this and save this locally to our file. So we can go to Annunziato and go to NEU, and we can have a webdev, and then 2017, summer of 1, webdev, and I believe it's here, public assignments, and we can drop it in here and call it that this is our home page, right? So let's grab it and call it home. Or call it index. Oh, we already have a home, an index, so we'll call it home. Okay. Now the home page is in here. Let's see, where is it? It's in assignments. There's the home page. Now the home page has quite a few things broken. Oh my goodness, what did I save here? I think I saved the wrong thing. Ah! That was not my intention. Page source. Is that really what I saved? It doesn't look that way, does it? Oh, am I saving? Oh, no, no. What I want is this. Let's see. Home. There we go. Okay. So notice that this is going to reference certain things that I don't have, right? It's referencing Bootstrap in a directory that doesn't exist for me, right? So I need to change a couple of things here, right? So let's see. Did we already download Bootstrap? I don't remember. Yes, we did. There it is, right? But did we download the whole thing? I don't believe so, right? I don't believe we downloaded the themes, right? We didn't download the fonts. We didn't download any of that, right? And we can install that very easily. But notice under Node Modules. See that Node Modules? And notice that Bootstrap is there. See that? Right. So I'm going to blow it away. I'm going to show you. If I remove that, delete. You can easily get a fetch of the entire Bootstrap library by going to template and saying that you want to npm install Bootstrap. Right, so that's going to go fetch it from the npm repository, and it will fail. What? Oh no, there it is. Okay, never mind. Yeah. Okay, there it is. So it's back there, and there's a couple of things here that we might need. These are the 3 directories that we really need, right? Under the distribution library directory. And if you'll notice in the home directory, it's actually looking for that, right? Dist CSS. See that? Right. So let me grab that. I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to copy that onto my public directory, onto my assignments, and I'm going to put it in here in the assignments. Right. Now, typically this would be its own deployed application on its own, hosted in its own server. This one is not, right? We're hosting the project, the assignment, right, and our top level page in the same server. But I want to implement it as if it was its own thing, all right? So let's do that. Let's install here under the assignment. Now wait, how am I going to do this? Because I have assignments in the evening and I have I'm going to have to do this again tomorrow. Okay, so I'm going to probably do this. I'm going to have 2 versions of this. I'm going to have the graduate version, and I'll have the undergraduate version. Undergraduate version. Okay, let's do that. All right, so under the graduate version, okay, it's very common to have a directory where you put all the libraries that you are using from other vendors, right? And one of the typical things to do is to create a directory called vendor where you put everything that is not yours, right? You know, Bootstrap, jQuery, all those, Angular, all those are things that you're copying from somebody else. So you're using somebody else's code. And under vendor, we can put here a directory dedicated for Bootstrap. So Bootstrap. And in here, we can then copy the distribution. I don't know if I still have it. There we go. Right under there, we have everything we need: the CSS, the fonts, the JavaScript, specifically for Bootstrap. Everybody okay? Right? Yes.
How do you decide whether or not you're going to copy that locally or use the remote version?
Okay, so for development, I am going to copy it locally, right? But when I'm going to deploy it at the end of the semester, right, it's a project, then we're going to switch all the links to be CDNs.
But for assignments, we're fine.
Yes, for the assignment, for as you're working on the project, use the development version locally, so that you can have auto completion, right? And you can have all those nice things that you wouldn't have otherwise. Okay. All right. So we have Bootstrap there. Yes. Right. And I'm gonna copy these files that we had originally in there. We're gonna put them here in the graduate. There we go. Oops, I don't want references. Move them. There we go, under the graduate. And now the home directory really is going to need to go where? Let's see. It needs to go into the vendor. Then it needs to go into Bootstrap, and then into the distribution, and then there's bootstrap.min. See that? It found it. It's no longer yellow. It found the file. Same thing I'm going to do with the theme. So this is going to be vendor, Bootstrap, and distribution. There we go. There's an IE10 workaround that I'm not going to support. And there's a theme CSS that I do not have. Let me go fetch that. Let's see. This theme, where is that theme? Here it is. I'm going to grab that. I'm going to save it locally into assignment, graduate, vendor, Bootstrap. And I'm going to put it in here, save, so that I can now link to it locally from vendor, Bootstrap, and then theme. There we go. This is some IE9 support that I'm not going to support. Some other IE stuff that I'm not going to support. And down below, notice that there's a couple of things out down below that we are using. See that? There's presumably they have they're using some library, the jQuery library, jQuery min there. See that? Okay. They also have a reference to some local Bootstrap JavaScript as well, which we do have. Let's grab that. That's also under vendor. Bootstrap dist.js. There it is. It found it. Docs.min. I'm not sure I need that. Docs.min. I don't believe I need that. I'm going to take it out. Also, IE workaround. I'm not going to support. Notice that these libraries, these script libraries, are down below at the bottom of the body. See that? Right? That's a very, very common technique, especially with very large libraries like jQuery or Bootstrap. These are libraries that might take a millisecond or two to download, right, for the browser to get a hold of. Because we don't want folks to be waiting for libraries to load, right? One common technique is to put these heavy libraries down at the bottom so that we can quickly show some HTML content to the user, right? And in the background, still download some of these libraries, right? As opposed to blocking, waiting for these libraries to load, right? And then starting to render, okay? So that's a very common technique to put it at the bottom. What else do we have? Let's see. These are being hosted by us. Eventually, when we deploy this at the end of the semester, we're going to change this to be CDNs, right? All right, I have the home page. Let's navigate to the home page now. Let's see what it looks like. Let's see if it blew up. Where do I have it locally? Don't I have it locally? Local hosts. Let's go to assignments. There is no index. Wait, what? Why isn't there an index? Oh, because we moved everything under undergrad or graduates, right? We moved everything. So let's fix that. Let's go to the link here we're not going to now say assignments. This is just going to be just a directory. So let's go back, refresh. If I click on assignment, it shows me the content of that directory. Yes? I can go into graduate, and there's my home page. Do I want the index page or the home page? I really want the home page. This is home.html. This is my home page, right? It looks pretty good, right? It's from what we have from Bootstrap. It's responsive, right? It's responsive. Notice that it has grid system. We have a top level there, right? And we can put some marketing jargon in here, right? So feel free to just make this your own. Okay? Make sense? All right. All right. So let's navigate now. Let's make this the index page. Let's make this the index page. So let's go back to our assignment, graduate, and this index page is pretty lame. I'm just going to remove it. Instead, I'm going to rename this to be the index page. Refactor, rename index. So now this will be the default index page. Okay. All right. Let's continue. Let's create some hyperlinks here to be able to log in and register. All right, so let's do that. Let's go into our index page, and our links are somewhere down below here. There are hyperlinks. Notice home, about, contact. It's these hyperlinks at the top, right? Notice that they have some classes so that you can highlight certain hyperlinks. Notice that this one has is like depressed, right? Depressed, so that it shows that you're there. That's the home page. Let's declare here this to be our login page. Login, and or register. Right, so this is going to be hard-coded to go to the login page, and this will go to the register page. Okay. So if I click on login, it's going to go to a login that I had already given you, right? The login page, right? Or the register page that comes here. Everybody okay? All right. Notice that the header is stuck to the top, right? That we want that. Notice that this is actually loading the login page and register page. They're hard-coded to go there. We're not doing single-page application yet, right? I believe some of you might want to get started right away. Go ahead if you feel comfortable with routing and injecting content. Get at it. Go ahead. Go ahead and do it. So let's play around now with the login page. So let's go to a login page, and in the login page, notice that these are all standalone files, right? They're standalone web pages, right? They have a full-blown HTML header, body, content, right? Eventually, we're going to remove all this, right? Eventually, these are going to be. We're only going to be left over with the actual content here, right? That's going to be the next assignment. Right? In this assignment, all these pages are self-contained, right? They can stand on their own, right? I can view this page on itself, all by itself, right? It has its references to the various libraries. Notice that it's trying to get a hold of the Bootstrap library in the CDN, which is fine. Eventually, we want that anyway. Let's see. We have the login page. We have the login at the top. Notice that we're using container, right? So that's giving us some of this margin on the left and the right, right? On the left and the right, and keeps us giving us some more margins, right? As it becomes smaller, right? Up until you get to the phone, right? I'm going to switch that a little bit. I've since I'm preferring this other content called the container fluid. Container fluid. This one, it just takes up the entire width of the page, right? All the time, right? It has those small margins all around, right? But it doesn't have these separate thresholds, right? And I found this to be easier to work with, especially with applications that are targeting phones. And you want them to be consistent across all screen sizes. Okay. All right. So we have the login. Let's see. We said that we are going to want a label here. Label saying that this is a username. Username. Also, it's going to be for this input field. So let's give it an ID of username, so that if we do a for username, right? If we click on the label, we also give focus to the input field, right? Same thing for the password. We'll give a label here. Label first we need to create the ID. ID password, and this is for password, and this is password. Right. So if we refresh, we click on the password, we grab focus on the input field. Everybody okay? All right. All right. Notice that after we load the Bootstrap library, there is a local style sheet here that is declared right after Bootstrap. See that? That's a very common technique for having local styles, right? That not only you declare yourself, but your own, but things that you might want to override that you don't quite like what Bootstrap is doing, right? You might want to add a couple of things. For instance, one of the things I don't like is that these input fields, they don't have margins, right? In between them, right? Notice that when there was no label here. Notice that these input fields were stuck one after another, right? I don't like that. So we could override that, right? So for instance, we can go into our style sheet, which a common place to put it is in a local CSS directory. So let's do that. Let's create that. Gradually, let's create a local CSS directory and actually create the style.css. This is our own. Notice that I didn't put it in vendor, right? This is mine. It's my style sheet. Right? It's not a vendor style sheet, so I'll put it in CSS. And a common name is to call it style.css. Some of you said that would like to try out and use less instead, or Sass. Go ahead, that's great. CSS is a static language, right? Where it's an imperative language. You declare. It's a declarative language. You say, I want all input fields to look, have a background red, right? And you declare that, right? And that's static, and it's going to be like that forever once you declare it. As opposed to a programmatic language, right? That says, well, I want it red when you hover over it, right? So you can put logic, right? And you can programmatically do things and if statements and loops and you can respond to events. CSS is declarative. You say, right, I want all input fields, right, to have a margin at the bottom of at least 5 pixels. Right, so that allows me to immediately say that there it is. So all input fields have a margin at the bottom of 5 pixels, right? And it's for us to be able to declare this, right? But notice that it's not programmatic; it's declaring this, right? As opposed to functional. Yes. Okay. All right. So that's a little better. Let's go back and put that label back in there. This is a password. Notice that the placeholder is username. It's kind of lame, or my placeholder is kind of lame because the label already says username, right? So typically in a placeholder, you might want to put an example of what is it that you're asking me to put in there, right? So instead, in the placeholder, something a little easier or more relevant would be some actual username, right? Maybe Bob123 or something, right? As a placeholder. Password for a placeholder, maybe something, whatever, right? As passwords. Okay, everybody okay? Right. Now to register, notice that the register link, right, navigates me to the register page, right, the register page, and it's an actual link, right. Notice that I have these links here. That is actually referring to that document, right, as a hard-coded. We're gonna go. So it's using the classical way of navigation, right, of referring in your hyperlink to an actual document that you want to go to, right? And this used to work beautifully. It still works beautifully, but it's falling out of favor, right? When a page knows exactly where they want to go, right? It creates a maintenance challenge, right? What happens here is that the logic of navigation is embedded inside of each page. Each page knows a little bit about how the navigation works, right? So there is no centralized place where all my navigation lives. My navigation logic is spread out over 2, 3, 20, 100 pages, right? That becomes a maintenance challenge. If you need to modify the navigation because there's a new feature or new policy in place and it changes quite often, it's very hard to maintain something where the logic is spread over so many artifacts, right? So that's where Model View Controller comes in and says, hey, you know what? The view should not be responsible for controlling the navigation of the page of your website. Let's centralize that somewhere, right? I think it's easier to visualize if you have any number of pages spread out across your website, and each one of them intimately know where they go. If you click here or you click there, you're having something akin to the go-to, right, in programming languages, right? You just arbitrarily jump from one place to another, right? And that just makes it very hard to debug, right? To be able to follow what's going on. If something's not working right, it just makes it a nightmare, right? You get what it's referred to as spaghetti code, right? You have to kind of say, oh, I wonder what happens if I jiggle this, right? And you're trying to see what's. It's kind of when you get this, right? You have no idea what's going on, and you start pulling, see what moves, right? And it's just it's a nightmare to handle something like that, right? Ideally, you have things nicely and organized, and everything is in its place. So instead, what we try to do instead is to do the following, right? Instead, we decouple the view, right, that displays the content for the user. We decouple that concern with the concern of navigation, right? We do not give the views the concern of navigation. The views never should know where they're going, right? Instead, they should notify somebody that says, hey, the user just clicked on this. I don't know what should happen, right? It's not my responsibility, okay? This event happened. They clicked on add element to shopping cart. I don't know what to do, right? They notify a centralized controller of the event, right? They posted a new post. They removed something from the shopping cart. They're checking out. They submitted their address, right? And then a centralized controller is responsible for the navigation. We decouple those two concerns, right? And then the centralized controller can then perhaps have some configuration file where you have a description of all your navigation, right? If you were here and this happened, then you should go there, right? And you can have a table where everything is very well defined. If you were here and this happened, this is what should happen. Yes, right? And it could be designed maybe in an XML file that maybe you can plug in a GUI, a user interface that allows you to drag and drop the navigation and move it around, right, and store it in this XML file. Yes? Right, you're decoupling these two things, right? And this is, today, this is where we are now. This is where we want to be, and Model View Controller introduces this idea, right? And this is certainly how Angular introduces this idea, right? The navigation should be decoupled, right? But we're not there yet. We're first going to implement it the old way, the spaghetti code way, right, where each page knows where they should go, right, and we'll refactor that next week. Yes? Okay. All right. So let's continue. So for the register page, so same thing, right? We have the register page, and we might have labels for each one of these. I'm not going to do these. You'll do them yourself, right? So this is username for the ID username, right? So you'll do this. So finish that up. And whether you click on login or you click on register and then you register, both of them navigate to the profile page, right? Which is almost okay. What's wrong with this? Notice that there's some content that is, is rendering below the header. Notice that the header is fixed to the top and the footer is fixed to the bottom. You see that? Right? We want that. We want these to be fixed to the top and fixed to the bottom. Let's see how they're implemented. Let's open up the profile page. They're being implemented by copying and pasting a snippet of code right from Bootstrap. Right? I believe the only thing that I changed here is the text fixed top. Right? And everything else is copied straight from Bootstrap. And what we have here is the classes right straight from Bootstrap. Then we have nav header, nav brand. All this is straight from Bootstrap. Okay. Maybe the other thing that I added was this glyphicon here. Oops. Wait. There we go. Okay. So what's happening here is that look at the content is slipping under. See that? Right? And that's happening because of this nav bar fix. So if we remove that, we have our original content, right? In this content, notice that it scrolls with the content. That's not what we want. Right? We want the fixed stop to be there, but it breaks the rest of the content, right? So if we inspect this, right, and we put it maybe to the right-hand side, we'll notice that this fixed stop, right, it's this div right here. It's this div that's right there. And then we have the rest of the container, right, is down below, right? It's this container down below, and we have the nav bar right up here. Okay, this nav bar here, but if we add the position, right? If we override the position and we say that we want it fixed, okay, notice that now I can scroll, right? But the header is stuck to the top. It doesn't move, right? And because position fix, that's what it does. Fix means just stay there. Do not listen to the scrolling for the rest of the content. You are not going to scroll, right? This is a very common technique that is used perhaps when you scroll all the way down to the bottom and you have like something you can click so you can jump right back to the top, right? Or also like they'll put a place where you can like them in Facebook or like them in some social network, and they'll just follow along, and it doesn't matter how much you scroll, they'll be stuck to the right-hand side or the left-hand side, right? They use this technique, fixed, position fixed, okay? And by default is fixed to the left, 0, and top, 0, okay? Right? And the width, notice that the width collapsed to whatever was inside of the div, right? By default, if position is not fixed, the div wants to take up the entire width of its container. That's what the div wants to do by default. It wants to expand all the as far as its container will allow it, right? When you remove it from the normal rendering, right, it collapses to the width of its children. Right, so default is to expand to the parent, right? Or when you remove it from the normal rendering, is that it collapses to the size of what's inside. You see that? And that's very important to know how it behaves in different cases. Okay? Make sense? All right. Now this allows you to move it around. By default, top is 0. Right? So notice that it didn't move. And by default, left is 0. Right? Although we could move it around, right? We could push it down a little bit or push it left a little bit. We could do that, but that doesn't look nice. Let's just leave it at 0 and 0. Okay? What about the right-hand side? The right-hand side, notice that the right-hand side collapsed, right, to the size of the children inside. But if we play around with that, the right, and we say right 0, what's doing here is that I want to stretch you as far as the right is to stick it to the right-hand side. Right, so we're kind of getting it back to its original size, right? Its intended behavior original, right? That it was taking up the entire width, right? But notice that we have to do this explicitly, right? Because it changes its behavior when you fix it. When you fix it, everybody okay? Right? Plus, notice that we have some plus here that is stuck to the right-hand side. So maybe we might want to add some padding on the right-hand side of 15 pixels, right? So that it's not flush to the right-hand side. Okay? So this override of all this layout, we could override it in our own styles.css, or so we could grab this, we could grab it, or we can just do an undo with a fixed stop, right? The fixed stop does all these things, right? It fixes it, it stretches it, right, and does all these things for us automatically, right? Except for that padding on the right. Except for that padding on the right. So we'll need to override, right? We're going to override this navbar fixed. We're going to override. We're going to grab the class. Grab that class, right? And in our styles CSS, we're going to paste that in, and that's the class as being applied on the nav, yes? Right, but originally, you could see what the actual rules is down there is dot navbar fixed, there it is, navbar fixed, dot navbar default, there it is, dot navbar default, dav navbar somewhere down here, navbar, there it is. So they're all being applied together. They're all being applied together to that one nav. Yes? So since I want to modify just this one nav, I want to make sure I'm very specific. Right? I don't want to muck around with other things. Right? I want to make sure that I want to apply it only to this nav bar. I want to add padding on that right-hand side because it looks ugly. So to be very specific, it's the nav bar that has the following class applied to it, and this class applied to it, and this class applied to it. I'm being very, very specific, right? It's only that nav with all these three classes applied together to that nav bar, okay? This is what it's called a selector. We are selecting that one element on the page. Yes? What do I want it to do with it? I want to add some padding on the right-hand side of 15 pixels. Okay, so if I refresh, notice that indeed it's applying to only that nav. Everybody okay? All right, so we dealt with that. So we are using the default Bootstrap for for fixing it, even though we know how to do it from scratch. Yes, we know how to do it ourselves, but it's best to leave it to the pros. The only thing is, because fixed, removed this div from the fluid rendering, right? It's no longer pushing the div that follows, right? It's not pushing it down. That's why it's rendering underneath. See that? So we need to compensate for this, right? We need to compensate for this. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab that content, right? Well, there's a couple of ways of doing it. One way to do it is to decide that this is going to be my main container, and that's where the main content is going to live, and push it down, right? We could do we could push it down. We can say add some padding above me, right, to compensate for the width, for the height of this header. Something like padding at the top for maybe 60 pixels, right? So that brings down the content so we can see it again, right? So we can see it again, and it scrolls underneath, which is okay. Notice that the footer has the same issue. See that? The footer has the same issue. So perhaps we might do the same thing at the bottom. We can say some padding below, padding at the bottom, also maybe 60 pixels, right? So that I can still scroll a little further. See that? Right? So that's one way to do it. And just applying it to the container, to the main container. Another way to do it is to just apply it blatantly on the body. Right, so let's remove those. Let's remove those. So we're still broken. You can apply it actually to the body. Right? So it's across the entire website. Right? You know that you're going to have this footer and header all over the place. Right? So you're always going to have it. So just push the entire body down. Right? So the body. You can also style it and apply those two rules, and there it is. So it pushes down the profile and the bottom. Yes? Either way would work. You just have to be consistent, right? Whatever you choose, right, you have to stick to it, right? Because this one is more reliable because it doesn't rely on you following a particular HTML structure or layout on your page. This one blatantly just applies it to the entire website. Okay, and this might be okay depending on your implementation. There it is. So I'm applying it to the entire body. So if I refresh, there it is. I can scroll up and down, and I have it. Everyone okay? That makes sense? All right. So there we go. So if we log out, we go back to the login. If we register, we go to the register, and if we register, we go to the profile. Notice that now if I log out, notice that the login itself is pushed down a little bit, right? Which is okay. You know, the real size, this is the real size, right? This is what it really, ew. That's what it would actually look like on a phone, right? It's too small, right? It's way, way too small. Let's see if we can fix that. If we go to the index page. If you go to the index page, notice that the index page looks okay on a phone. Right, it looks okay. Let me put this on fit. Let me put it 100%. Actually, looks okay on a phone, but not our login page. Let's see. Let's go to the login page. It's way, way too small. Right. What's happening here is that originally. And careful, right? View your content on a phone, or view it here on this simulator, right? On Chrome. Make sure that the font is readable, right? What's happening here is that originally browsers before pages used to be responsive, right? Which has been most of the time, they were not responsive. Browsers made an attempt to render the page verbatim as you would see it on a desktop. Right, you would visit a page, and it would try to render it as if you were looking at it on a huge screen. Obviously, in such a small screen, the only way to achieve that was to reduce everything, scale it to fit on such a small screen. And this is exactly what's happening here, right? It's trying to reduce this all the way down to something small. So, but because we are making the page responsive, right? We don't want this feature. Right? This is an actual feature that's still lingering up to today, right? That if you, by default, it will try to shrink it, right, to fit it as if it were as they would look like on a desktop, right? We don't want that, but we need to explicitly say that, right? Notice that the home page is okay, right? It looks okay on a phone, right? Well, if you see it on 100%, okay, it looks okay, right? So let's see what they do to achieve this, right? So the way they achieve this is by manipulating the viewport. Let's look at the viewport. So the viewport is the actual window, right, that gets rendered, that is viewable at all times, right? There might be more content below the viewport that is not being shown right away, but whatever is being viewed, right, that's what we call the viewport. So here's the viewport. There it is, okay? And we can configure how the browser, right, or the phone or the tablet should interpret, or what should it do with the view, right? By default, if I comment that out and we go back to the home page and I re-render this, notice that it becomes unusable, right? It's just too big, or there's no way that I can see this content, right? Instead, by bringing it back, right, it says, what we're telling it is do not scale it. Leave it as is. Don't shrink it to try and fit it in such a small screen. Leave it in its original size, right? So here's what we're saying. We're saying initial scale 1, meaning the original scale. Leave it at 1. Don't try to scale it down, right? Leave it at its original scale and use the original width of the device, right? Do not try to scale this. Right? You can scale it to make it look bigger, right? So you can make it look a little bigger, right? Actually, no, I'm working against the grid system, so I'm not going to try and work against it. So we're going to do the same exact thing on our own pages. Let's bring that into our login page, and let's put that in our meta. And let's do the same thing on our register page. So let's do the login page. Let's look at the login page now. We go to the login page. Now it looks okay, right? It's a nice size. If we go to a register page, it's still not good, right? So let's do the same thing for the register page. Let's go to the I'm at the register page. Let's paste that meta. Let's refresh the register page. Now it looks okay. Let's go to the profile page. That's not good, right? So let's do that the same thing on the profile page. Let's put that meta tag right there. And now it looks okay. Everybody okay? All right, there we go. Fixed profile. Okay, log out. And log out just goes back to login. So there you have it. You have the first 3 of the pages for the assignment, right? The home page. Then you have the login, the register, and the profile. There'll be a lot of refactoring when we come back next week, right, to make it single-page application, start actually being dynamic, injecting the content, but we'll cover that next week. All right. I'm going to leave it here.